In 1945 Paris, Marshal Henri-Philippe Pétain went on trial for his life, accused of treason at age 89. Pétain had saved France once on a First World War battlefield, but when his countrymen turned to him to save them again as head of government during World War II, he failed spectacularly. Pétain never knew what he did wrong, and though he faced execution, it was France that paid the price for his failure. In 1916, 60-year-old General Petain, who'd been passed by for promotion most of his life, took charge of a horrific World War I battle that would mark France for generations. The Battle of Verdun, called the Meat Grinder, was the first in modern history where one army's goal was just to kill maximum numbers of the enemy. Amidst this death and destruction, Pétain came to life.
So he was a career army officer, and he had a full career and never heard a shot fired. Petain's war did come, just 1 year before his retirement.
Notorious for going against the grain, Pétain had argued for building a strong defense backed up by artillery before the war, when other French officers promoted offensive strategies and the idea of élan.
Élan is French for spirit, the spirit of the bayonet. The French army believed that not only would war have to be fought offensively, but that the primary offensive weapon was the bayonet, not the rifle, not the machine gun, not artillery.
Pétain never bought into that. He was far more practical, and he said, look, you can have all of the élan that you want, but that will not help you against automatic weapons fire and heavy artillery. And because of that, he was seen as a heretic.
In 1914, the heretic was proved right by the series of disastrous mistakes that turned into World War I. The French soon discovered that defense was as critical as offense. In February 1916, German artillery and troops launched a savage surprise attack on the French city of Verdun. Thousands of French soldiers were massacred the first few days. Verdun was about to fall, and with it, perhaps, France's hopes for victory. The French High Command ordered Pétain to hold the city no matter what. Pétain headed straight to the battlefront, something few generals did. As soon as he arrived, he began issuing orders that would turn him into a national hero. He started an innovative rotation system to give foot soldiers breaks. He reorganized supply routes and repositioned artillery guns. Each of these defense-based changes saved French lives and helped the war effort.
Pétain was unique among First World War generals in that he had a real feeling for the common soldier in the trenches and what he was going through.
It was Pétain's belief that after 8 or 10 days in the battle at Verdun, a division would be so weak that it needed to be taken out of the line and rested.
This made him very popular. In fact, he became quite quickly the most popular general in the French army with the average soldier.
A young officer, Charles de Gaulle, even requested assignment to his staff. De Gaulle, whose life would be intertwined with Pétain's, soon became his protégé. If the men below Pétain loved him, those above did not. He successfully defended Verdun as ordered, but argued against launching a counterattack. Pétain was shunted aside to a desk job. General Robert Nivelle, who was happy to send men to the slaughter, took his place. Verdun lasted 10 brutal months, with close to 1 million casualties. The battle finally ended in December 1916.
Verdun was an identifiable battle that lasted longer than any battle in history and inflicted so many casualties, so many French soldiers participated, and the experience was utterly gruesome.
Officially, Verdun was considered a French victory. Élan seemed to have triumphed. Stuck at general headquarters, Pétain could not stop Nivelle from launching another offensive further north a few months later. It would lead to disaster.
The attack goes in April 16th, 1917, in a driving storm of snow and freezing rain, horrific weather conditions. The Germans are completely prepared and waiting on them in brand new defensive lines.
The French army suffered enormous casualties to such an extent that almost the entire French army was in a state of complete mutiny in May of 1917.
They didn't mutiny and shoot their officers or do anything violent. They simply said, we're not going to go. We refuse to get up and climb over the trench and be killed.
And it was in this situation, as Charles de Gaulle said, that France had to choose between ruin and reason, and in this moment, Pétain was called upon.
Ruin surrounded them. Within months, a German mutiny led to chaos and collapse, while Russia's mutiny helped to spark a revolution and communist takeover. But thanks to Pétain, the French mutiny ended peacefully. Other generals would have ordered court-martials and executions. Not Pétain. He headed back to the front lines and met with the mutineers. He improved food supplies and quality. He increased men's time on leave, and they loved him for it.
He'd climb up on the hood of his car, and he would tell them, look, I know it's been hard. I know it's been difficult. It's been a long journey, but what would you have me do? The enemy stands on the holy soil of France. They still are there. Is that how we should leave it? No, you don't want that, and I don't want that. I will not ask you to do the impossible. And then he ended with his famous phrase, we will wait for the Americans, and we will wait for the tanks. And that's all they needed to hear, because fresh troops arriving, reinforcements, and new weapons, tanks. Then we'll go on the offensive again. He kept that promise.
Tanks and American troops did finally arrive and helped France and Britain defeat Germany in 1918. But France was devastated.
World War I was an unprecedented bloodletting. France had lost 1.5 million dead, another 1.5 million or 2 million maimed. The land was sown with shot and shells, and cities were leveled. And much of that had been repaired, much had been recovered physically. But morally, mentally, the French felt that they could not fight another war of that sort.
The defense-minded Pétain had been ignored before the war. Afterward, he was hailed as a prophet. 1920s France followed his lead and built a huge chain of connected defensive forts facing Germany, called the Maginot Line. It stretched from France's northern border to the south. The First World War had left France weaker, but Pétain stronger. He was made Marshal of France, the nation's highest military honor. He served on top government committees, represented France abroad, and was briefly Minister of War. Finally getting support from above, he saw his support from below explode. A campaign started to recruit him for head of state. Pétain loved it.
After the war, a whole generation of Frenchmen went back into civilian life with a sort of almost heroic, angelic image of Pétain as the man who had saved them from battle, saved them from the trenches, or saved them. And it's very important in understanding what was going to happen 20 years later.
France called those 2 decades the Hollow Years. Painfully slow recovery from the war left people demoralized. The country seesawed between socialists and communists on one side and a homegrown fascist movement on the other. Governments rose and fell, strikes broke out, and people rioted in the streets. By then a revered elder statesman, Pétain's respect for elected officials plunged, while his fear that France would sink into chaos soared. And chaos was on its way. France was surrounded by it.
With the rise of fascism in Italy, communism in Russia, and Nazism after 1933 in Germany, France was the place into which hundreds of thousands of refugees poured. It was the country with the largest number of foreigners in Europe, and many of them Jews.
In 1939, the man responsible for most of those refugees, Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland and started World War II. The Poles he didn't massacre, he enslaved. He shipped Poland's resources to Germany and filled the country with concentration camps. The next year, he turned toward France, which was waiting behind its Maginot Line. Beginning May 10th, German tanks and fighter planes ripped through the French countryside. They swept past the Maginot Line, which proved useless. In 6 short weeks, the Germans reached France's Atlantic coast. The French fought ferociously, but were unprepared and disorganized. 110,000 died. Many more were wounded, and close to 2 million were taken prisoner. France had 2 choices: keep on fighting despite the losses, or surrender.
The French government actually had a plan to evacuate itself to North Africa, where France had large numbers of colonial troops. The French Navy could move to North Africa. Much of it was already there. About 1,000 French planes from the French Air Force flew to North Africa. The French Army could have engaged in a guerrilla war. The French population could have engaged in a guerrilla war.
The choices were clear, but difficult. The government was paralyzed and unpopular. It desperately needed someone to rally the people, and found him, the last surviving World War I hero, 84-year-old Marshal Petain. As fighting raged on, he agreed to become Deputy Prime Minister.
He was trusted to bridge all the various gaps, left, right, army, society, young, old, and lead the country, whether it was in a continuation of the war or into a peace.
Over 100,000 French troops had just escaped across the English Channel along with their British allies. Britain's new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, tried to persuade the French government to keep fighting.
The image of Churchill is this man who will fight to the bitter end and fight in the streets and fight in the hills and the fields, to use his later speech. That's wonderful because we understand how this thing turned out. But as far as Petain was concerned, this was just another British politician who'd been in office for 1 month. He's talking about fighting to the bitter end as he withdraws troops. It's nonsense as far as Petain was concerned.
Petain's skeptical comments won over the cabinet. The Prime Minister resigned, and Petain filled the power vacuum. On June 17th, convinced that he knew what was best for the country, Petain stepped up to a microphone and announced over the radio, "With a heavy heart, I tell you today that it is necessary to stop the fighting."
It's not that people were enthusiastically dancing in the streets at the end of France's involvement in the war. I think they realized what was coming, the occupation was clearly going to happen, and so on. But there was a relief that, after all, soldiers were not being killed anymore, and that whatever this war was going to be like, France was out of it. And that's why Petain was so popular.
Hitler offered France something he offered no other defeated country: an armistice. For Hitler, it meant more troops freed up for further conquest. For Petain, it meant France could sit out the war and therefore survive. But to rub France's nose in its defeat, Hitler demanded that the armistice be signed in the same railroad car where Germany had surrendered to France in World War I. Petain and much of the French public considered this humiliation one they could live with.
There was a widespread belief, and this included Petain, that this was the wrong war, that this was a war being fought on behalf of the English, or the Poles, or the Jews, but someone else, and that Hitler should be fighting the Russians, the communists, that France had no quarrel with Hitler.
What's the point here? Why are we going to keep going? Whereas if we can just sign a treaty, the war will end, the Germans will go home, we'll lose a province or two. Better luck next time.
Not everyone agreed. Charles de Gaulle, in an act Petain condemned as treason, fled to Britain to carry on the fight from abroad. Hitler then split the country in 2. Paris and the north became occupied France. Petain and the bedraggled French parliament headed south to the resort town of Vichy. Southern France, Petain's domain, became known as Vichy France. Petain demanded that the pre-war French Parliament vote itself out of existence. And it did.
And so Petain was getting given a completely free hand. He was basically handed a kind of constitutional dictatorship. No constitution as such, just you, Petain, may do what you wish, whatever you judge best, for France.
France placed its trust in Petain. Most French citizens, reeling from their defeat, believed the armistice was a wise or at least a necessary choice. But what Petain did next was neither wise nor necessary. France's defeat was purely military. Its battle plan was disastrous, and Germany's was brilliant. But instead of blaming the army, Petain blamed a 150-year-old event, the French Revolution, which had replaced the king with the ballot box. Democracy was the disease, and Petain had the cure.
He thought that the French Revolution had been a wrong turn, that you needed to have instead a country that was ruled by a father figure, and people knew their place in society and did their duty and were obedient, and then you'd have a strong country.
Petain announced that the French Revolution's motto, liberty, equality, and fraternity, would be replaced by work, family, and homeland.
The ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. This meant weakness, and that what you needed was not liberty, but discipline. Instead of equality, you would have hierarchy. Instead of fraternity, what you would have would be authority.
Petain had become enamored with fascism, which is really reprehensible to look back at from our distance and our perspective. But at the time, it made a lot of sense to a lot of people and played on some traditional right-wing concepts already in place in France, then gave those a name and a slogan and the whole bit.
Petain proclaimed a national revolution, and he set to work remaking France. But Petain was not free to do exactly what he wished. He needed Germany's help, or at least its permission.
There was a repeated request by the Vichy French government to the Germans, let us work together, give us better conditions, and we will collaborate with you.
From Petain's perspective, this was simply being realistic. The Germans seemed to be unstoppable. If they could destroy France, who else couldn't they beat? Could Russia stand? Could Britain stand? Could anyone stand before them? And if that was the case, then it was simply a matter of being prudent to understand that and recognize that, and then France as a nation could move forward.
Petain met Hitler for the first and only time in October 1940.
Petain seems to have started off thinking that he could get a relationship with Hitler because they both served in World War I. And so he played that card as best he could. I don't think he thought very much of Hitler as a person, but Petain was trying to find a way to create a relationship that would smooth France's path.
Hitler never accepted that. Hitler had been a foot soldier in World War I. He hated the French. He regarded them as decadent and corrupt. He hadn't forgiven them for winning World War I. He didn't want to give an inch. What he meant by collaboration was making their economy available for the German war effort.
After the meeting, Petain announced over the radio, "I enter into the way of collaboration." Petain's Vichy government would give the word collaboration a sinister new meaning. While Nazi policies laid the groundwork for the final solution, Hitler's plan to kill every Jew in Europe, Vichy showed its own particularly French anti-Semitic underbelly.
What the Vichy government did was to conduct a census and to create a card file with the name and address of every Jew in France. And the Germans used those card files when the time came to start applying the final solution in France.
Vichy passed a series of laws in 1940 and 1941 banning Jewish teachers, doctors, lawyers, civil servants, students from universities, and so on. So pushing Jews out of public life, but not actually physically hurting them. By 1942, when the Germans started to put pressure on Vichy to hand over Jews to be shipped off to Auschwitz and elsewhere, Vichy was quite happy to do this on condition that they were not French Jews. And the French themselves did the choosing. French-born Jews are French, we're happy to discriminate against them, but you can't have them for your death camps either. It's a strange distinction.
France would deport close to 76,000 Jews to German death camps. Only about 2,000 would survive. Throughout Vichy and occupied France, propaganda films featuring Petain's fatherly image assured the public that Vichy was doing everything possible on their behalf. But by 1941, rationing and forced labor were turning growing numbers of French people against Vichy. One man complained, "Work, family, and homeland has given way to bother, hunger, and surveillance." Anger focused not on Petain, but on the Vichy government, which was full of Nazi supporters. People began to wonder if their beloved but elderly Marshal was being used as a figurehead.
Petain was in charge less and less as the war went on. That doesn't mean that he didn't know what was going on. No laws were passed that he didn't know about.
Hitler wanted material, and so there was an agreement to produce aircraft. Lots of trucks were built for the Germans, and tanks were built for the Germans. French agricultural production went almost entirely to Germany. The French didn't have enough to eat. And so France was probably the single most important participant outside of Germany itself in the Nazi war economy.
Vichy propaganda failed to disguise the harshness of a program called the Obligatory Work Service, which shipped close to 700,000 French workers to German factories.
A lot of young French boys, and not only young ones, ran into the woods and forests in southern France to avoid being sent to Germany. And the only way they could survive was by joining the resistance. And that is why we call the French resistance the Maquis, M-A-Q-U-I-S. And the word Maquis has nothing to do with resistance, it means woods. And of course it's because the resistance was born in the forests of southern France.
Thousands disappeared into the woods. Maquis sabotage and information collecting helped pave the way for the planned Allied landing in France.
Petain viewed resistance as traitors. He felt that he had the right formula, the right recipe for French revival. Without a disastrous war, France would revive because it had an authoritarian government and a disciplined population, and that was the way to go.
Resistance membership was never large, though after the war, huge numbers claimed they'd belonged. But Allied victories and news of de Gaulle and the Free French battling the Nazis did change growing numbers of hearts and minds. And in 1942, with Allied troops about to land in French Algeria and Morocco, American President Franklin Roosevelt tried to recruit Petain.
Petain was contacted by Roosevelt indirectly to announce that we're going to do this, and we need your support, want your support. And we'll even understand if you do it surreptitiously. We don't expect some public proclamation so the Germans can shoot you, but at the very least, you've got to work with us at least under the table. And he refused, absolutely. Then it became a matter of, is he really supporting France, or is he simply a toady to the Nazi regime?
On November 11th, 1942, 4 days after a major Allied victory in French North Africa, Germany swept into southern France and crushed any last trace of French independence. Vichy officially became a Nazi puppet state.
One of the great mysteries is why Petain didn't lay down his burden and take the plane that was available and go to North Africa and say, all right, our experiment failed. We will now go back to fighting the Germans. But Petain was firmly locked in to the role he had adopted for himself. He thought he could save something by staying in place and keeping France neutral.
D-Day, June 1944. The Allies landed in France, and with them came the man the world increasingly recognized as France's true leader, Charles de Gaulle. Petain, who had earlier sentenced his one-time protege to death for treason, tried to arrange a peaceful transfer of power from one head of state to the next.
His capacity to see things realistically had pretty much abandoned him by this time. He was 88 years old.
Nous sommes menacés encore d'une invasion de la France. Qu'est-ce qui se passera à ce moment-là? C'est encore un sujet d'inquiétude.
So he quite unrealistically thought that his power was still legitimate and he could hand it to de Gaulle and no one would deal with him.
De Gaulle marched triumphantly into newly liberated Paris. Petain was arrested. Petty collaborators received street justice, but Petain, the victor of Verdun, was put on trial for his life, charged with treason. Claiming that history would vindicate him, he refused to testify and instead read a statement saying, "If I could not be your sword, I tried to be your shield. Day after day, a dagger at my throat, I struggled against German demands."
He was being tried, so to speak, for having betrayed France by fooling it into accepting his leadership, collaboration, the illusion of armistice with Hitler and so on. But of course the fact of the matter is, and no one could say it at the trial, not only had he done that with a lot of political backing, but he had had huge national backing as well.
Petain's defense lawyers were very skillful, and in effect they rewrote the history of France during World War II in a way that still has some appeal to a certain number of members of the French public. That is to say, France was defeated in 1940 by an overwhelming German force. The sane thing to do was to accommodate with it, and the Germans were going to turn France into another Poland, and Marshal Petain managed to save them from that. Now this is a total fabrication. France was a much bigger, richer country, and the French were to be a war resource for Germany and not something that they wanted to annihilate.
Petain had turned France's 1940 military defeat into a moral defeat and tried to remake France into a semi-fascist state. He almost succeeded, but the destruction of Nazi Germany also doomed his national revolution. The jury sentenced him to death, but Petain was still a hero to many. To avoid unrest, de Gaulle commuted his sentence.
And so the compromise was to find him guilty and then exile him, in effect, to an island, which is, after all, what was done to Napoleon, and for rather similar reasons.
Imprisoned on an island off the coast of France, Petain died unrepentant in 1951 at the age of 95.
As the man himself declined, so did his nation. In 1856, the year Petain was born, France was at the zenith of its power, under the Second Empire of Napoleon III. By the time he dies, in 1951, France is a shadow of its former self. He lived through those events, and he was part of those events. And I think that makes him such a tragic figure.
Petain was a man of limited abilities and unlimited pride, placed in a position of great power. Once there, he dragged his fellow Frenchmen into a moral nightmare.
A lot of French people found that they had been more or less, by no decision of their own, put into a position, if they happened to be policemen or firemen or workers in the Renault plant that turned out tanks for the Germans, they turned out to be helping the Nazis. They had to live with this shame that the Vichy government brought on them of having to collaborate with an evil government and to collaborate with the final solution.
Petain's fear of chaos and contempt for democracy almost destroyed the nation he claimed to love. A lifelong friend once said, Petain cared more about the French than he did about France. In the end, he damaged his country and his countrymen, and decades later, the wounds have yet to completely heal.
Je regrette l'amour d'autrefois, ces jours heureux où je ne pensais qu'à toi, ni les ennuis, ni les oublis ne me feraient changer d'avis. Où est l'amour d'eau?